Hello. In this video, we're going to take a journey. And before a journey begins, it's often best to first know where you've been and where you are now so that a clearer picture of where you want to go can emerge. With that in mind, before the question, what is sustainability, can be answered, let's first go back to the 1970s when much of the world had descended into a painful recession that was compounded by unprecedented increases in the cost of oil, rises in unemployment and inflation, and a growing number of costly problems that added to the decade's overall misery and unnecessary expenses. For example, in a growing number of cities around the world, people were told to stay indoors to avoid increasing levels of smog. In New York, children living in a neighborhood community named Love Canal began developing rare forms of cancer and other life-threatening illnesses at a rate that far exceeded what was considered normal. The residents eventually learned that their community had been built on top of a toxic waste dump. And in Ohio, one of the state's main waterways, the Cuyahoga River, caught on fire after becoming saturated with oil, chemicals, and garbage. In response to these catastrophes and the enormous pollution and healthcare costs and cleanup expenses that resulted from them, the federal government set higher standards for emission and pollution control by introducing more laws that restricted the amount of pollutants a business could emit. Of course, the response from the business community was entirely predictable. Business leaders claimed that requiring their companies to reduce the expenses that their actions imposed on the general public would dramatically increase product and service costs, slash revenues, touch off a further decline in the economic prosperity and competitiveness of the country, and result in massive employee layoffs. So you can imagine the surprise when the 3M Corporation, an American manufacturing company based in Minnesota, publicly stated that it not only welcomed the new laws, but that it would voluntarily go beyond them by setting even higher pollution control standards. 3M made this decision because this man, Joseph Ling, who worked at the company and had a PhD in sanitation engineering, managed to convince his co-workers that what many people think is a normal and necessary part of business, truckloads of garbage sent to landfill sites, smoke billowing from smokestacks, discharge flowing from drainage pipes, and so on, that this pollution is nothing more than waste, and that waste is always an indisputable sign that a business is hemorrhaging money. Ling also recognized that waste is any substance that emerges from a business which cannot be sold, and that manufacturing this non-product is proof that a business is not obtaining 100% from its purchases and investments. And the more a business wastes, the more it has to purchase. But in the late 1970s, this observation was not a part of mainstream thinking. So there was quite a bit of disbelief when Ling rationalized that if 3M made efforts to reduce its waste, the company would enjoy substantial cost savings in terms of lower raw material use, fewer disposal costs, and reduced pollution cleanup expenses. Further shockwaves were created when 3M declared that it would rely on two pioneering methods to eliminate its waste. First, rather than collect and treat waste after it was created, as the law stated, 3M declared that it would prevent waste at its source before it became a problem. Second, the company insisted that frontline employees would play an integral role in obtaining this objective. The standard method at the time was to keep employees out of the loop and hire engineering specialists and pollution control consultants to provide solutions. So this idea of bringing in outsiders was also seen as revolutionary. Let's first look at the distribution of electricity. As this model shows, as much as 70% of the energy produced from burning coal can be lost in the power plant due to poorly insulated and poorly designed furnaces. From the amount of electricity that emerges from the plant, 10% can be lost due to inefficiencies in the transmission lines. From what emerges out of the transmission lines, 10% can be lost because of inefficiencies in the motor, and so on. The end result is an enormous loss of the initial investment, as much as 90% or more. More to the point, as the world's population continues to grow, and as people live longer and become more affluent, and therefore consume more, costs such as these become increasingly difficult to ignore, particularly when you take into account that most of the world's countries are in debt, and these countries cannot continue to cover the cost of waste in all its forms. So how much does it cost to eliminate waste in a business? Well, sometimes the answer is zero, particularly when it's a behavioral issue. A good example is the Polk County School District in Florida, which saved $60 million over a 16-year period by mostly turning off electrical equipment. However, other situations may require some financial investment. The good news is that the Carbon Disclosure Project, which examined over 500 large companies, recently concluded that 59% of investments made in energy efficiency or renewable energy alone pay for themselves within 3 years. This is seen at companies like Walmart, which saves over $200 million every year on transport fuel because it's working to make its delivery trucks more efficient. The British retail chain Tesco provides another good example and is now saving over $239 million a year by working to reduce its carbon emissions. Keep in mind that in business terms, carbon emissions are nothing more than a sign of waste. GE is also saving a fortune. And the deeper a company digs, the more the news just gets better and better. For example, Walmart enjoys an additional $3.4 billion in savings every year by having its suppliers reduce packaging waste by 5%. How is this possible? Well, think about it. Walmart is the world's biggest retailer, which means it has to deal with thousands of deliveries made to its stores every day. And each delivery is wrapped with packaging material which Walmart has to pay to throw away. And that adds up fast. So rather than pay for disposing tons of unwanted packaging waste, the company works with its suppliers to reduce what is essentially an unnecessary expense for both parties. And the results? Well, the results speak for themselves. Additional examples of waste elimination include Canada's Hudson Bay Company, which saved $12 million off its electricity bills over a 6-year period by reducing the business's energy needs. And DuPont, which saved $3 billion on pollution control projects over the course of 3 decades. In one case alone, DuPont reduced production line inputs from 25% to less than 10%, thereby lowering its landfill costs, freeing up $140 million in production sales, and saving millions more dollars in capital expenses because the company was able to delay the time needed to build a new factory. On and on it goes, in companies both big and small. Indeed, in 2011, the McKinsey Global Institute estimated that the world could save $2.9 trillion every year by the year 2030 if it simply used its energy and resources more efficiently. In other words, if it eliminated waste. So let's go back to the 1970s and its infamous recession. Coincidentally, at the same time Joseph Ling was dealing with production waste at 3M, several far-sighted individuals in Europe were waking up to the reality that oil prices would probably continue to rise as the world's population continued to multiply, and that no matter how many jobs new and growing businesses could create in the coming years, it might never be enough to satisfy demand. Not knowing how to resolve these challenges, a call for research was made to investigate the relationship, if there was one, between energy use and manpower. And as it turned out, there was a correlation. And the key to understanding this was revealed by a man named Walter Stahel, a Swiss architect working out of Geneva, Switzerland. Sometime earlier, Stahel had discovered that when considering the total amount of energy and manpower in production, represented here in units of 25% as part of the 100% required of each, roughly 3/4 of all industrial energy consumption is associated with the extraction or production of basic materials. The remaining 1/4, he observed, is used in the transformation of these materials into a finished product. Conversely, he noticed that the opposite is true of labor. About 3 times the manpower is used to convert basic materials into a product than is used in the extraction and production of raw materials. Take a closer look at Stahel's observation, because it reveals that in the first stage of many manufacturing processes, much of the world's environmental degradation takes place and most of the greenhouse gas pollutants are produced, and all while employing the least amount of people. Stayhill went on to explain that by closing the loop, or in other words, extending the use of the materials that go into a product, or extending the use of the product itself, less energy is needed, less waste and pollution is created, and more people are employed. The latter of which is because material recapture employs 9 to 60 times more people per ton than a landfill site. The added bonus is that production costs are lowered, because the original time, raw materials, energy, and labor, which are normally thrown away, are recaptured and reused, thereby reducing the need for more material extraction and refinement. Put another way, Walter Stayhill explained that the linear consumption-based economy, which is based on extraction, refinement, manufacturing, distribution, consumption, and disposal, that this pathway is also littered with waste, and it spends more money on energy than labor when it could be the other way around. And again, that's because whenever we throw anything away, the original time, energy, labor, and raw materials that went into making it are also discarded. So now we have to go out and buy more. A good example of how Stayhill's circular economy concept works is seen at Caterpillar, a major manufacturer of heavy-duty construction vehicles. In the 1980s, Caterpillar began closing its production loops by opening the first of what became 3 remanufacturing plants. Apart from creating jobs, remanufacturing allows the company to not only reuse its resources, but also resell the results up to 3 times. In other words, it makes a product once, and by remanufacturing it up to 3 times, the company can sell it again and again and again. Think of the profit margins involved in that. Now, this is critically important because businesses can't remain profitable simply by saving money through the elimination of waste. They have to make money too, which is why closed-loop remanufacturing, or in effect reselling the same resources over and over again, is so significant. Another classic example of the profitability of closed-loop processes is seen at Interface, the world's largest manufacturer of commercial carpet tiles. By closing its production loops, or in its case, turning the tons of old carpets that are thrown away around the world into material for new carpets, the company doubled its profits, nearly doubled employment, and watched its stock price increase 550% over a 5-year period. Now, to be sure, this is not something that a business can do overnight. One of the challenges of closing a company's loops involves reverse logistics, or finding a way to transport the business's used materials back to it for recycling or remanufacturing purposes. But as a wise person once said, where there is a problem, there is an opportunity. And it's here where the profit potential of closed-loop practices intensifies. And again, we can thank Walter Stayhill for his work in this field, because he took his observation one step further and looked at how everyday products can be turned into services as part of a profitable, circular performance economy. An example of this is seen at the Michelin tire company, which has moved from only selling tires into selling the performance of tires by manufacturing a long-life tire that's easy to retread. The retreadable tire is then sold as a service, which means that the customer buys the benefit the tire provides, in this case, the distance the tire can travel, with the tire remaining under the ownership of the company the entire time. Therefore, instead of selling the tire, the company sells kilometers or miles, or in the case of aircraft, takeoffs and landings. The customer only pays for what it wants the tire to do. If the tire fails, or when the tire reaches the end of its performance life, it's taken back by the company so that all the materials, the labor, and the energy that went into making it can be reclaimed. Just as important, the consumer doesn't have to pay disposal costs, or waste costs, or repair and maintenance costs. Again, he or she only pays for what a tire is supposed to do. The hotel industry has benefited from a similar practice for years. For example, linen suppliers lease clean sheets and towels rather than selling them. The linen supplier does all the washing and repair, which saves the hotel time and money, with an average economic break-even point of around 3 years per item. In other words, the linens have to last at least 3 years before the company can make a profit, so the company is driven to lease high-quality textiles that last longer. Indeed, in all these cases, quality has to increase. Otherwise, the product could not be reused or resold. And as always, the longer the materials, the labor, and the energy are used or sustained, the greater the profits. All of which helps to answer the question, what is sustainability? Although over 300 definitions exist, one of the more common is the capacity to continue into the long term, just as we've seen here. In a business sense, this means reducing expenses, including future expenses, in every conceivable form so as to facilitate the longevity of resources and thereby increase financial competitiveness. Keep in mind that the word expenses also includes eliminating the future costs inherent in the use of toxins and their disposal, as well as the health issues caused by pollution and future cleanup operations. In short, what I'm talking about is eliminating the usual long-term expenses that are all too often dumped on society, all of which we pay for in one way or another. These are called externalized costs. Remember our portrayal of the material economy or a linear economy? It depicts a linear flow of materials from extraction to refinement to manufacturing to market distribution to consumer consumption and finally to disposal. As we saw earlier, each one of these stages is filled with waste and costly inefficiencies, as well as externalized cost, which is why only focusing on the two end stages, which many people do, doesn't even begin to encompass the full breadth and depth required to achieve sustainability. Let's go back again to Joseph Ling and Walter Stayhill. As you may recall, Ling's focus was on waste elimination. Stayhill's contribution is resource extension or closed-loop economics. Each represents one side of the same coin, and both represent the core of sustainability in a business context. In other words, to get the maximum benefits that sustainability offers, these principles must be applied up and down the economic production chain from extraction to production to use, disposal, and reuse. That's quite a challenge, because the fields and subject areas that comprise the entire sustainability scenario are almost endless. But generally speaking, in a business context, the basic components begin with the financial, economic, and industrial benefits that we've already touched upon here. And although these provide powerful incentives for businesses to begin thinking in the long term, before any benefits can be reaped, every business will have to first dig down deep and get its people interested in sustainable practices. And that includes employees, suppliers, and customers. This in itself is a monumental task when you consider that the human brain is wired to think in the short term, not the long term. And you know what I'm talking about. The human desire for instant gratification, even if it means losing a greater payoff later. All of which is compounded by the notion of out of sight, out of mind. The fact that not every resource or material can be repeatedly recycled provides additional challenges. And for reasons that include stranded capital, stubbornness, good old-fashioned procrastination, lack of capital, a general lack of knowledge about sustainability, and a dozen other physical and mental obstacles, some businesses may never want to jump on board, which means that governments will have to get involved in order to ensure that they don't run out of the resources that their nations depend on, particularly if these governments are either bankrupt or in debt. Indeed, one of the best ways that a country can ensure that it won't be faced with expensive future problems is to think and act in the long term. And that means thinking about the environment, because it all begins and ends with the environment. The environment is the sole source of every resource used in business and our lives, from the simple and basic, such as water, to the more complex, things like metals, chemicals, and rare earth elements. A basic understanding of and research into all of these disciplines and how they must work together is what makes sustainability both fascinating and challenging. It also adds to the confusion because each subject area speaks its own technical language and each sees things from its own point of view, which is why so many of the people in these fields all too often don't understand one another or work together. So let's finish this introduction to sustainability by going back to basic waste elimination and resource optimization, as well as job creation and job security, and the generation of long-term well-being and wealth. Sustainability is therefore not about sacrifice, and it's not about taking away anyone's rights. From a business standpoint, sustainability is mostly about reducing expenses, including future expenses, in every possible way in order to maximize profits, facilitate competitiveness and longevity, and enable a more comfortable way of life for everyone, including future generations. And the application of sustainability starts with what my students have heard from me so many times that they call it Scott's Law. First, eliminating waste, think Joseph Ling, and then focusing on closed-loop economics, think Walter Stayhill. It doesn't matter if you're working in an office, or manufacturing a product, or streamlining a production line, or designing a building, or developing a smart grid for more efficient electricity distribution. To reduce costs, achieve optimal efficiency through sustainability, these two principles must be at the core of every activity. If you'd like to read more about sustainability in a business context, you're welcome to download any of the free materials from the website of the Center for Industrial Productivity and Sustainability at www.cipsfoundation.com. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video in this series.